Well, hey friends, welcome back to the studio. My name is Maya, and today is going to be a long-awaited video. How do you make a plaster mold for your reclaim? Here is a plaster mold that I made ages ago. These are really great tools for doing your clay reclaim, but you can also use them for molds if you make a different shape. The process is really easy and quite cheap as well, so there's really nothing stopping you. So let's get into it. Okay, so the tools that you're going to need for this project are, first of all, you need a bucket. This is a plaster only bucket. And in fact, I have the formula that we're going to be using here written on the side so I don't forget it. You definitely want to have a bucket exclusively for plaster. And that is because you never want to mix your plaster in with your clay reclaim. So be really careful when you're working with plaster. I don't want you to have works in progress out, or especially not clay reclaim out, that your plaster can get mixed into. If you get plaster mixed into your clay, it pretty much is going to destroy your clay. Your clay is not going to work in the way that it should. So yeah, just keep them separate. And I always just have a plaster only bucket that I reuse whenever I make plaster molds. Next thing you're going to need is some sort of mold form. So I have this shape here. I like using these types of clear boxes, and particularly in this material, because they're flexible. So this is going to be really handy if you can move this at all. This is going to be really handy when it's coming to getting your mold out of its form. It doesn't need to be clear. They just come in clear in my area, but any sort of plastic box will work as long as it is flexible. Secondly, you want to have a very flat bottom. So a lot of times these types of boxes, at least in my area, they're sold with like a ribbing on the bottom or some sort of thing that I guess is going to add strength to the box itself. But we want to have that flat bottom because the bottom is actually going to be the top of our mold. So we need a really flat bottom. And I like to have these ones that have some sort of corner piece to them that kind of go out in the corners. You can see on my mold that it kind of like goes out in the corners. What I like about this is that it protects the actual body of the plaster. Plaster does break down and wear over time. It's pretty fragile material. And you can see even as I'm like setting it down on the table, I'm like creating a few crumbs here. I like to do it this way because then it sort of protects the main body of the mold. And especially you want to avoid having like really sharp edges. If you have really sharp edges on the edge of your mold, it's going to just slowly break down, and having this little extra bit helps. But this part is definitely not necessary. Next, you're going to need some sort of scale to measure out the plaster. And then you're going to need a measuring device to measure out the water, okay? Lastly, you need some sort of mold releasing agent. So this is stuff that I get from the Pottery supply that is specifically for mold making. It's called Trennemulsion auf Deutsch. I don't know, I think it's called mold soap actually in English. I'm not sure about what this stuff is. I believe it's some sort of animal fat. I didn't buy this, I actually inherited it from a different potter. If you're not interested in using something from an animal, you can also use something like Vaseline. I've also, in a pinch, had great success with just using hand lotion. So any sort of oil could work. You might want to do a test on it, but I would try like even like cooking oil or something. It might actually work. I've heard of people using Pam, like that spray oil. So you don't necessarily need to buy like this specifically made mold making stuff. I use lotion a lot actually, and it does work. So long as your box is a little bit flexible, because that will help also in releasing it. What else? Oh, and then of course you need plaster. For this, I would definitely recommend you getting the plaster from your ceramic material supplier. They're going to have the correct type of plaster that exists out there. There's a lot of different types of plaster that's made for like different projects. So like people who are smoothing their walls, that's a different type of plaster than what this is. Don't make that mistake of just going to the hardware store and picking up a box of plaster that I did in the very beginning, because that's not going to work. What you want to get is what's called modeling plaster, or in German we call it Formengips. Modeling plaster, I think, is the English. Casting plaster. Casting plaster might also be the correct term for it. But whatever plaster you're buying from your ceramic material supplier, that's going to be the correct plaster, because ceramicists pretty much use only the one type of plaster. Use this plaster for making recycling bats, but also for making molds and, you know, 2, 3, 4, 10-part molds or whatever. So it's the exact same stuff. Okay, so this is going to happen in 4 steps. The first step is to coat the inside of your mold with whatever releasing agent that you're using. I have made the mistake of mixing the plaster before I applied the releasing agent. That's not a good idea, because as soon as the plaster starts mixing, it's going to start setting. So then you're rushing to add your releasing agent. So definitely don't do that. So what I do is I just take a little chunk in my hand, and this stuff is really gonna last me forever, because you just smooth it around. You don't want it very thick at all. Ideally, like fairly transparent. Can you see me smushing it around? So I'm just using my hand to mix it in here. And then also want to apply slightly up the side. So I'm going to apply like, you know, what is that? 3 centimeters? Or let's say 5 centimeters up the side, AKA 2 inches. Make sure you get all around in each crevice. Okay. And then wash your hands, because this stuff is nasty. Now that our mold is coated in the releasing agent, we can start mixing our plaster. The amount of plaster that you're going to mix depends on your mold itself. I would say don't go any larger than this mold, because it's kind of heavy. This thing is kind of heavy, and especially it gets heavier when it's wet. So at the moment it's 5.5 kilo, and I would say up to maybe 8 kilo when it's wet. So I wouldn't go any bigger than this, but of course you can go smaller. If you want to go smaller, you can also use like a pan from your kitchen or something, like a baking pan. But for ours, because I'm mixing 5 liters of water with 5 kilo of plaster, I'm going to weigh up 5 kilo of plaster and put it in the bucket. And what I can do with this cool kitchen device is just put the bucket right on top and adjust for the, what is it called? Adjust where 0 is. Try not to be super messy with when you're throwing your plaster around. Plaster is very similar to clay in that you don't want to inhale the dry stuff. So I do recommend getting a proper container for your plaster and not just taking it out of the bag that it comes in. And then we're gonna always clean up the powder with a sponge to avoid getting it into the air. Okay. So I know that it looks like it's basically full now. The bucket's basically full and it's not gonna fit 4 liters of water, but it is. Plaster is very spongy. It can take on a lot of water. So no matter what amount of plaster you have, you always want to add in this ratio of 5 plaster to 4 water. And this is why the metric system is so great. And I have no idea how to deal with that when it comes to the imperial system. This is why I switched over to metric ages ago, and I do recommend you do that too. Imperial system sucks. So I'm gonna go ahead and add the water. Just pour it in. I'm trying to pour it in slowly so it's not gonna make a big poof. But I do wanna get it in there pretty quickly so that I can start mixing it. Now, the next part of what I'm going to tell you is probably like not the best way to make plaster. Probably you want some sort of machine to properly mix it. If you are making molds, like molds for slip casting pottery, when you want them to pick up all these very precise details, this is kind of the hard and fast way that I've used for years and years to make plaster molds just for recycling clay. So if you're trying to slip cast clay, this is probably not the best way to do it because I'm always left with a few chunks of plaster in the clay. It's absolutely fine for what we're doing, and I don't think it makes my bats any weaker. This tutorial is specifically for making plaster bats to recycle clay with, all right? So I'm just getting my hand in there and I'm mixing it. As I'm mixing it, one thing you don't want to do is like splash it around too much. And this is because we don't want to add too much air into the clay. So you want to kind of mix it like slowly but surely. And as I'm mixing it, I'm kind of squishing out the little pockets of plaster that have not gotten wet yet to try and squeeze out some of these extra lumps and chunks. And this is why I don't think that this technique is suitable for casting ceramics, is because you do still retain some of these lumps. So I think that people probably use like a machine to mix the plaster otherwise to get all that stuff, all those chunks out. So I'm mixing it for, I don't know, let's say a minute, 2 minutes max. I'm just gonna say it's good enough. And then I just use my normal cleaning bucket to clean up the plaster. The plaster will eventually settle down to the bottom of the cleaning bucket, which is fine. I'll just pop out that dried plaster at the end. So step 3 is to just pour the plaster into your mold. So the main thing that you want to keep in mind when you're doing this is you want to not splash the plaster too much, because we do want to avoid getting air bubbles into our mold. So we're going to pour it in, and then like how I like to think of it is like you pour it in one spot and let it kind of like expand from that spot. You don't want to pour it in here and then pour it in there and then, you know, have it splash all over the place. You want to pick a spot and then let it just kind of ooze out from there, if that makes sense. So it might splash a little bit in the beginning, but just try and control it as much as you can. Here we go. And then at the bottom, you're gonna see some chunkage. It's fine. Okay. So I'll say it's step 3.5. I forgot about the step when I was thinking about the steps. We are going to shake this to try and get out as many bubbles as possible. So I can kind of wiggle my table a little bit. If you can do that, great. So just wiggle it. Maybe you can go a little bit back and forth like this. Basically, you just want to vibrate it. And what that's going to do is bring up any of the bubbles that are kind of embedded in the plaster bat, and they're just going to push them up to the top. And eventually they'll pop. So I'll wiggle the table for about a minute, try and get all those bubbles up. Okay, and then now we wait. So go get yourself a cup of coffee, go throw a few pots on the wheel, give it about 15 minutes before you check on it, because it's gonna take some time before it starts hardening up. But don't forget it, because we do want to remove it from the mold before it completely dries. So just keep an eye on it. So you know it's starting to get to the time when you should take it out, when you can feel the warmth from the plaster. I don't know the chemistry of this, but some sort of chemical reaction happens that produces heat with the plaster. So you can actually feel like the plaster feels warm. Feels really nice. So I think this is ready to take out. So what I like to do is to kind of like push the walls away, and you can sort of start to see it pulling away from the bat, and then just flip it out. So yeah, so you can just push it from the bottom, and if it releases, you're lucky. Not, just push some more. And just be careful it doesn't smash down. Okay. So why we took it out when it was still wet is because you'll see that this bottom is still a little bit bumpy. And what I like to do is just take a rib and smooth out any of those bubbles. Because if you do this now, it's less likely to chip off into your clay later on. Okay. Just smooth it out as much as you want. And then the other thing that I do is I like to kind of peel away this hard edge here. So I'll use my rib at an angle and I'll just kind of shave off any of the sharp parts. Yeah, so that's pretty much it with your plaster bat. You do, of course, need to let it dry out. I guess that's the last step. And it is going to take quite a while to dry out completely. So what I like to do is put it in my kiln room. So I'll actually lean it up against the side of my kiln because that will help it dry faster. But don't put it like on top of a hot kiln because that's gonna be too fast. That's gonna make it dry too fast and will probably crack. But I like to lean it against the side, like near my kiln. And that seems to work out for me. So I'm probably gonna put this clip at the end, but I wanted to show you before I actually got started mixing the plaster, what you do in between uses of your plaster bucket so that you don't have to clean it out with a ton of water or throw away your bucket or anything like that. What you wanna do is you just let the plaster completely dry out, and you can see in here now it's just like dried up plaster stuck to the side. What you can do is just compress. You just squish it and your plaster is gonna come off in big chunks. So make sure when you're deciding on a bucket that you're going to use for your plaster that you can kind of squish it and it just comes out. If there's any little bits left over, you can just use a rib to scrape it out. And it comes out really clean. Easy as that. And then this stuff you want to make sure you throw away. You do not want to get this stuff mixed in with your clay. And the same thing goes for your molds too. Just scrape all the gunk out. Making a plaster bat is really that simple. So I hope that that video was helpful for you. You can write down below in the comments if you have any questions about the process, but it's not that complicated. Just jump right in, use the right plaster, use that ratio 5:4, and you pretty much can't screw it up. So yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye, friends.